Adelante, doctora.
Pues muy buenos días a todas y a todos y a todes. Para mí es un gran placer tener el día de hoy a Peter Browning con nosotros. Pues digamos que nos va a presentar un trabajo que suena estupendo, ¿no? Desde el punto de vista de la reflexividad, de la posicionalidad en una temática que es muy actual, muy importante y que refleja, pues, digamos que las complejas relaciones de la migración en todos nuestros países, ¿no? Entonces, vamos a tener esta presentación que nos permitirá también ver, eh, focalizar la mirada en la cuestión metodológica de nuestros trabajos dentro del área de la sociolingüística etnográfica crítica. Recordemos que estos webinarios están en el marco de un proyecto PAPIIT que justamente se intitula Aproximaciones a la migración en entornos educativos desde la sociolingüística etnográfica crítica. Y bueno, pues voy a decir algunas palabras sobre la trayectoria de Peter. Peter se ha incorporado recientemente al Centro de Lingüística Aplicada como profesor de lingüística aplicada, tras haber sido investigador postdoctoral QUIRC, Lenguas del Futuro, en el Instituto de Estudios Avanzados de la University College of London, aunque tengo entendido que ahorita te encuentras en la University College of London, ¿cierto? Ujú. Y en este recinto ha investigado sobre la experiencia lingüística vivida de las personas queer colombianas en el Reino Unido, que es el trabajo que nos presenta el día de hoy. Y en este espacio también cofundó el clúster de investigación Lenguas del Futuro. Es un sociolingüista con un gran interés en las intersecciones complejas entre el discurso, la sociedad y la cultura. Obtuvo una beca de la Economic and Social Research Council para realizar su propia investigación etnográfica, sociolingüística, crítica sobre la implementación de una política bilingüe español-inglés en el municipio Río Negro de Antioquia, también en la misma universidad. Ha colaborado en varios proyectos de investigación sociolingüística cofinanciados, entre ellos creadores, defensores y usuarios de políticas lingüísticas como co-creadores de investigación sociolingüística, migrantes en desarrollo en Londres, en la University of Westminster, y experimentando el exilio en familia, el imperativo de hablar de los exiliados colombianos en el Reino Unido, en la University of Southampton. Es miembro de diversas organizaciones profesionales como la Higher Education Academy, del Comité Ejecutivo de la British Association for Applied Linguistics, del Comité Directivo de la sede londinense de la British Academy Early Career Network y de la Comisión de Investigación de EDISO, a la Asociación Española de Estudios del Discurso. Damos la palabra a Peter, quien nos presentará el día de hoy Spaces of Sexile, a Sociolinguistic Study of LGBTQI Colombians in London. Adelante, Peter. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, doctora Laura. Muchas gracias por la invitación. A Laura, Daniela, a todo el equipo. Es un honor estar acá y poder compartir con ustedes. Voy a cambiar para presentar en inglés, pero al final, si hay preguntas, comentarios, lo podemos manejar en inglés, español, como quieran. Ok, entonces. So I've called this presentation Spaces of Sexile Subjectivity, Queer Colombians in London. So the things I really want you to take away from the presentation, the discussion today, is this concept of sexile. So what does it mean to talk about sexile in the context of sociolinguistics, and especially in the context of migration? Subjectivity. What does it mean for us as sociolinguists to be interested in subjectivity, and how can we approach that ethnographically? And for me, what's really interesting and a line of work that I've been trying to develop in my scholarship is how this is a spatialized process. So seeing how the materiality of space is a very important aspect of all of these questions. And that's perhaps nothing new for those of us who are interested in migration, right? Because we think about space. So I'd like to begin with a quote that I find inspiring. So a caress that is a grind, that is a ripple, that is a surge, that is an embrace, that is a swell, that is a tidal archipelago of our shared horizons, of our collective will. So these words accompany Joseph Funnell and Carlos Maria Romero, also known as Atabi Mamacita, their Huracan Caress project, which was an Arts Council England project, which they described as an invitation for those who refuse to be alienated from their bodies by the historic project of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy and the violence of the colonial project enacted across oceans. So this was a defiant arts-based project of claiming their lived, embodied experiences as queer migrants of color, a collective project of defiance. So what I'm sharing today is perhaps something akin to the beginning of that quote, a caress, something small, but I hope that one day this project might grow into something like a tidal archipelago. Also, before I begin, I want to share a content warning, especially for queer and marginalized members of the audience. So I will be sharing rather detailed descriptions, including videos of abuse, of murder, of death by drowning, of execution and violence. So if you think this could cause you harm, please do leave, switch off your screen, do whatever you need to do to make yourself feel comfortable. Do within your sphere of possibility and action. Do for those who couldn't. A report into violence against LGBTQI plus people in Colombia has shown a stark increase. At least 164 LGBTQI plus people were murdered in 2024, with close to 87% of these cases still in the initial stages of investigation. At least 43 LGBTQI plus people have been executed in Colombia in 2025. That's about 2 people a week that have been reported, or indeed who have been able to be reported. And this number is consistent with a rising trend of the last few years. This is Nawar Jimenez, murdered on the 22nd of May 2025. Nawar was a trans social leader, a human rights defender, and a sex worker. She was killed and her body thrown in a river in the outskirts of Carmen de Bolívar in Colombia. This is Alessandro Coati, murdered on the 6th of April 2025. Alessandro was a molecular biologist, originally from Italy. He studied an MA at UCL, the university which I now work, and he'd worked for the Royal Society of Biology in London. He was tortured, murdered, decapitated, dismembered. Parts of his body were stuffed into a suitcase. Others were thrown into the river. Forensics are still ongoing to ascertain which parts of his bodies are still missing in Santa Marta, Colombia. This is Francisco Cadavid, murdered on the 21st of April 2025. Francisco was a 64-year-old man who was ambushed in his own home, where he was murdered in Medellin, Colombia. This is Sara Mireille, murdered on the 6th of April 2025. Sara, a trans woman from Medellin, Colombia, was targeted by a group of vigilantes who tortured and abused her. Having broken her arms and legs, they threw her into the river where she was left to drown, whilst passersby filmed. This is Ivan Carrillo, murdered on the 9th of April 2025. Ivan was a university student like many of mine. Walking back from the gym, Ivan was attacked and murdered. He was found dead in an alleyway in Cartagena, Colombia. This is Martín, murdered on the 1st of March 2025. Martín was a well-known and appreciated teacher, like many of us. As usual, Martín went out for a walk with his dog on the evening of the 1st of March and was found murdered the next day in Caldas, Colombia. We must remember too the many people who are not able to be included in this list, their non-normative desire deemed a worse crime than that committed by their murderers, the moralized silence around their death, the euphemisms, the erasure of their sexuality in the media, a complicity with and a carte blanche for the Águilas Negras and other paramilitary organizations. The Águilas Negras pamphleted Rio Negro when I was living there in 2014, warning that they would be carrying out what they called social cleansing, limpieza, a fin de mejorar la convivencia y seguridad ciudadana. On their list of targets, alongside thieves and druggies, maricas. This violence is in no way new in Colombia. Indeed, what we're seeing now has many ways that the aftershock of la violencia. As a queer diasporic Colombian artist who's pictured in this slide succinctly puts it, military dictatorships, Marxism, Christianity, colonialism, and other totalizing forms of knowledge have produced societies fraught with repression and conflict in Latin America. Sexual and gender difference have historically been their targets. It's unsurprising then that LGBTQI plus Colombians are forced into both internal and external migration. Migration is in many ways central to the queer experience. Indeed, for geography scholar Binney, migration occupies a central place in coming out narratives. For example, it represents a key way in which space and place play a significant part in the formation of sexual identities, cultures, and communities. Escaping place to travel somewhere else in order to discover one's sexuality is the major trope within coming out stories. The wish to discover one's sexuality, so is the trope of coming out stories. The wish to escape the boundaries of one's own nation is likewise a familiar trope within gay literature. In many instances, the need to migrate is not so much born out of the desire for pursuit of the American dream, but out of the very real fear and threat of persecution in the country of origin. Migration is not always a choice, but a necessity. Thus, we are not talking here of economic migrants, but political refugees, people for whom being a sexual dissident is either illegal or makes one vulnerable to brutal attacks, persecution, or the threat of death. The precarity that Binney centers is important as it precludes a banalization of the case of queer Colombian migrants in the UK. This is a matter of life and death. But as he goes on to remind us, and in resonance with scholars like Judith Butler, the existential threat of death and the ability to do something about it are deeply materialist questions and require specific readings of concrete diasporas to truly understand their unequal dynamics. So looking at queer Colombian refugees in the UK, we can talk about this specific diasporic group. But this is a population that is deeply heterogeneous, fracturing along ratio, class-based, as well as regional and gendered and political fault lines. But we can all understand them all as being exiled from their country of origin, Colombia. So I opt for the term exile here rather than migrant or refugee as a purposeful way to weave together the experiences of different generations of LGBTQI plus Colombians living in the UK. So the so-called political exiles of La Violencia of the 90s and early 2000s, from whom the term exile is perhaps more readily applicable. For those arriving later, fleeing from the political project of Uribismo and the mainstreaming of far-right ideology. And those who have arrived post-peace in light of the rising tide of paramilitary and vigilante murders of LGBTQI plus people, weaving together these experiences purposefully to highlight the central threads of the structures which have occasioned their exile. London is a city where I live, I love, I work, has, as Ackroyd tells us in his monograph, Queer City, a history of queerness. It appears in numerous cultural products as synonymous with freedom. Going to London is a shorthand for fledging one's rainbow plumage. But this is more than a story of what Binney calls queer cosmopolitanism. Queerness is part of what Silver would call the urban imaginary of the city, or in Bennett's terms, a mythopoesis. So it's a framework which acts on and through people and creates the socio-spatial contours of the queer city of London. So the space of London as a queer city is enacted in concrete day-to-day action, and we can't take it for granted. Colombian exiles in general, let alone LGBTQI plus exiles, have until recently been all but absent from understandings of the so-called Latin London. Whilst researchers have paid attention to waves of exile from Chile and Argentina, it's only now with work by Alston in cultural studies, McIlwain in cultural geography, from whom I take this map, and Patiño Santos in sociolinguistics that these experiences are being understood. Studies on exile show time and again the importance of solidarity networks. And I'm thinking here of the work by Bloch et al., by Patiño Santos. They show that co-ethnic, co-lingual spaces in which people can find support and information are really important to facilitate their transitions. However, as Christian Valenzuela has shown in the only work that I know of to do with queer migration in London and Latin Americans, he's shown that these spaces and these networks are not often accessible to queer Latin Americans in the UK, because these spaces reproduce many of the same dynamics that queer migrants or queer exiles left their home countries to escape. Indeed, according to the UN, las personas lesbianas, gay, bisexuales, trans y de género diverso sufren mayor exclusión y discriminación cuando huyen de sus países en busca de refugio y protección. So not only this are they excluded from co-ethnic spaces, but furthermore, queer exiles are often excluded from so-called mainstream queer spaces. As the experience documented by queer Dominican living in exile in the USA, Jimmy Lan, in the preface to his anthology of poetry. And I'll just leave it here for a moment for you to read. So this text was included in the preface to a collection of poetry and was translated by the author. And we can see there are differences in the English and Spanish versions. And there appears to be slightly different narratives, dependent on the imagined reader. So for the Spanish speaker, there seems to be more emphasis put on the politics of recognition. And this interesting expression, um, the anonimidad in inglés, so kind of a stripping back of the self through the layering on of language. But I think what emerges in both accounts is um, the double marginalization that Lamb has experienced, so being excluded from mainstream queer spaces, and the impacts that this has had on his ability to make the USA in this context his home. So Lamb uses the term sexile to title his book of poetry. But it's originally a term that comes from Manuel Guzman in an endnote to a chapter that was written in 1997, in which the author reflects on his own experiences negotiating his sexuality and gender identity as a Puerto Rican living in New York. So Guzman explains the term sexile as a neologism of mind that refers to the exile of those who've had to leave their nations of origin on account of their sexual orientation. This concept, for which I'm grateful to Adriana Patiño Santos for drawing my attention to, can be a useful frame, I think, for focusing on the specific impacts of exile as lived out by LGBTQI plus individuals as they imagine and materialize new futures in their new societies. Despite the utility of this term, it has had minimal scholarly uptake, mostly having been used in the study of Latin American diasporic literature. For example, González Adrienum has an interesting work on this, and often in a US context, so not in the UK context. So I both take up this concept and I stretch it out to embrace our genderqueer and trans kin and understand sexile as the exile of those who have had to leave their nations of origin on account of their sexual desire or practices and or gender identity and expression. So making it a more encompassing concept. So researching sexile, I suggest, is more than researching this category, but it's using a framework that grants access to an experience of a political or a politicized subjectivity. It's a rallying call which conspires in the sense of breathing together with the spectre of Nawar, of Sarah, and of so many others. It's a radical category that, at least in my uptake, is driven by intimacy and desire, which rejects a liberal politics of identity. But it's necessarily strategically essentialist and identitarian in nature, which I think is the only ethical response to the necropolitical landscape from which these dissenting bodies are forced to flee. Within sociology, increasing attention is being paid to queer experiences of the UK migration infrastructure. So I'm thinking here of an interesting project being carried out at the University of Nottingham by Diego Garcia and others around querying asylum, so looking at the asylum system through a queer lens. This is also a concern for civil society. There's a number of NGOs that have been set up to help queer asylum seekers navigate this process. So thinking about rainbow migration and Mirko Rainbow. But what is not surfaced when I look with my ethnographic sociolinguistic gaze are the socio-affective and existential dimensions of being and becoming. So once again, to enter into dialogue with that cultural geographer Binney, we therefore have to get under the skin of the reasons why people are attracted to cities and nations and stimulated to migrate, either as tourists or temporary or permanent workers. It's clearly much more than a freedom from restrictive laws. It's also the freedom to become something, something else, the elsewhereness of belonging. So this elsewhereness of belonging centers the affective experiences of becoming, processes of subject making, to get under the skin, to understand the body in place, and the placiness of the body. Or in Alamino's terms, imagining human corporality as transcorporality, in which the human is always intermeshed with the more than human world, which undermines the extent to which the substance of the human is ultimately inseparable from the environment. It is to understand what Binney calls queer epistemologies of international migration. So exploring Sexile then is exploring an episto-ontological category about being and understanding the world. There are both phenomenological and hermeneutic dimensions here. Sexile opens a discussion of queer time-space, sexile as chronotopic configurations of queer temporalities and spatialities. And it's here that we can finally breathe a sociolinguistic sigh of relief as we begin to make sense of how we as sociolinguists can enter into this discussion. As we think about Colombian sexiles, the concept, Bush's concept of Sprachenleben can be useful. So the lived experience of language. And what I find useful about this concept is that it opens up a lens through which we can see language as a resource. So an understanding of language that explores individuals' linguistic repertoires, as closely related to cultural backgrounds, migration trajectories. And such conceptualizations of language offer for an investigation into the role of specific resources, how they play a role in sexiles' ability to materialize their imagined futures. So in the case of Colombian sexiles, this tends to be a competence in English, in Spanish, different varieties of Spanish, as well as other language and linguistic resources they have gained along their migration trajectories. What's more, and moreover, we have important things to say as sociolinguists about language as narrative. So this conceptualization of language being related to the claim that migration can be seen as an example of what Bainham and Defina and Gray and Bainham call self-production. So the stories that migrants tell about their journeys being a process of self-narration. So narration not only plays a central role in shaping the memory of events and allows for the telling of previously untellable experiences. I'm thinking here about work that I've done with Adriana Patiño Santos, thinking about narrative and memory. But it's also an important semiotic site in which the construction and negotiation of anticipated futures takes place. Thinking here of the work of Miguel Pérez Milans and Lively. So an attention to language as narrative then allows for an interrogation of the discursive construction of time space of sexiles, the remembering of queer futures as they're imagined, as they're frustrated, and as they're lived out through language, through narrative, through practice. So it's at this point in the presentation that the genre of the talk, the normativity of the speech act, requires me to share some data, some preliminary findings, and believe me, I really wish I could. So almost 9 months ago, I submitted this project for ethical review. Its sense of self stripped back somewhat through the layering of institutional discourse, divested or perhaps freed from some of its intellectual synesthesia, and straightened in Ahmed's terms, straightened to fit in with the institutional frame. I framed it as a project about the lived experiences of language with some ethnographic shadowing and some life story interviews with self-defined queer Colombians living in London, accessed via existing social networks. So a very straightforward project. Almost 9 months, 2 rounds of review, a new job, a new faculty, countless follow-up emails, and the application is still hanging in limbo. It's deemed as high risk, the high risk status that takes it from committee meeting to committee meeting, from inbox to inbox. The tentacular life force of the project potential spreading, dwindling. I wonder in a thought experiment, which is perhaps too plausible to be frivolous, if the provost himself has been asked to sign off. At a time when, at least in the UK, academic freedoms are being restricted, departments are being closed, some topics are maybe too hot for the university administration. I'm reminded of Ahmed Jaber and Miguel Perez Milan's 2022 reflections on the politics and voice in higher education. And I ask another sociolinguistic question. Who can say what and when and within which institutional spaces and with what effects? However, for the want of sharing some data, I've decided to revisit the chapter that I shared earlier in the talk. This is a chapter published by Cristian Valenzuela. As I say, it's one of the first and only, to the best of my knowledge, chapters written about queer Latin American migrants in London. And what I've done is I've revisited this chapter with that sociolinguistic lens. And this is in no way a criticism to Valenzuela's work. Indeed, I find this a very inspiring chapter, but I've used it as a thought experiment and an intellectual activity to think about what does it mean to bring a specific language focus to these data. So when I talk about the language focus, I'm going to base the analysis on this idea of Sprachenleben, so language as resource and language as narrative. So I'm going to share a number of quotes that came from Valenzuela's article and then just pick out some key ideas. So this comes from one of the migrants who's now living in London. And he said that I like that it's so international. On the street, you hear millions of languages, people of all colors living harmoniously. It is a global center. So here we see language topicalized, but language is almost not seen as something to discuss, right? It's there because it's something positive, but we're not sure what those languages are. We're not sure how the participant interacts with those languages. We're not sure how they affectively orient to those. In another example, a participant shared that here there are many sexual health clinics where you can go and ask for help or information. If you have something, you can go and they offer you assistance. There have been times when I have been fairly ignorant about some things, but here in London, it's truly easy to approach any of these places. And I thought this quote was interesting coming from a language as resource perspective, because the participant talks about how easy it is to go and ask for help. They offer assistance. It's easy to approach these places. But what this implies is a competency in English. These services are offered in English. So this is something that is not explored in terms of the migrant or the Sexile experience, is what does it mean to have these linguistic resources? What are the services that you can access? Or indeed, is there more behind this? Are there language brokering practices that happen here? Or are these services that are accessed perhaps in Spanish? Another participant said that London definitely has a spectacular sexual health system. It's so easy to go to a sexual clinic and talk to a specialist. It is also very easy to approach people about their experiences. So again, here we get this idea of the ease of talking, and indeed talking to a specialist. So here, implicit is the English language, but it's never topicalized. It's never brought to the surface, either as a problem or as a benefit to these exiles. So I thought that was interesting to think about from a linguistic perspective and something that isn't in the original analysis of these data. Another example here, a participant said, I don't feel the need to interact with Latinos, but when I do, I feel comfortable. But I wouldn't want to create a Colombian ghetto and have been around Colombians for most of my life. If I wanted that, I would have just stayed in Colombia. I don't feel part of a Latin American community. It would mean to live, I live like, that should say, live like you were in Colombia, but in London, because they eat Colombian food and listen to Colombian music all the time, and they speak Spanish all the time. So interesting, here we see that Spanish is topicalized, but here Spanish is seen as something negative. It's seen as the opposite to the life that this Sexile of Valenzuela interviewed wants to create in London. So if we think about language as resource, just in these short examples, we see that it's often backgrounded or it's obviated, it's not spoken about. Perhaps it's celebrated in the first example, but it could also be seen as a problem. But interestingly, I think the problem is here is the Spanish language, not the English language. So this helps me to see that there's something more to explore here. There's something else to see, talking to more Sexiles and perhaps topicalizing their language. But more than that, thinking ethnographically, observing lived practices. So what happens with language in these interactions? What happens in the sexual health clinic? How are these information really gathered? What are the practices and processes around these things? So there's a reflection there for me and perhaps for us in terms of how we can engage with these questions around language ethnographically. So another angle thinking about language as narrative here. So one of Valenzuela's participants says that I'm not interested in being part of any closed community. Perhaps if I had to say that I was part of a community, I think I would say I'm part of a gay community more than a Mexico or a Latino one. Being gay has defined me more than being Latin American, I think. So something that struck me here in the narrative construction is this comparative dimension, right? Being more gay than Latino, being more than. So there's a distinction, there's an understanding of these two as separate categories, of which one can position themselves as more one thing than the other. So a navigation here of kind of two worlds. Another example, no, I don't really go to those places. I don't go and I wouldn't really like to. They don't catch my attention. I've always rejected the idea of being an immigrant and having to gather with your own national community. I don't identify with it. So here I thought the spatialized dimension was important. Thinking about those narratively, how those places again are constructed as different. So these co-ethnic spaces. So there's a spatialized imaginary and organization of places of being Latino and places of being gay, and how those places in a spatialized way don't seem to align. And that has impacts on these positionings of self. Also, I thought it was interesting that this participant rejects the idea of being an immigrant. So there's these category terms that we use academically, but again, it's an important reminder to think emically about how these categories are lived out and experienced by participants. Interestingly here, though, whilst this participant rejects the category of immigrant and positions themselves as distant from those places, they also talk about this idea of a national community. So they recognize that there is such a thing as a national community. So we can see a bit of the tensions arising here in terms of positioning of self, of how that subjectivity is understood. And then this example I shared previously from a Colombian Sexile that Valenzuela interviewed. I don't feel the need to interact with Latinos, but when I do, I feel comfortable, right? And talking about they speak Spanish all the time. Analyzing this, not thinking about language as resource now, but thinking about the narrative construction, there's an interesting use of pronominal distancing. So the I statements are very clear. They elucidate a very clear position. I don't feel the need to interact. I feel comfortable doing this. I would have, if I wanted this, I would have stayed in Colombia. Right? Um, Whereas the you, it would mean to live like you were in Colombia, but in London. So there's a projection, isn't it? A differentiation there of things that I do, but things that you might do. Uh, and then even more distance is the they, right? They who speak Spanish all the time. So there seems to be a hierarchization in this narrative of ways of being a sexile or ways of being a queer Latin American migrant. So the way that I do it, the way that you might do it, and the way that they do it. So looking at language as narrative maybe helps us think about these us and them dynamics, so how people position themselves in relation to others. And it stages the tensions and the struggles of what it means to negotiate this subjectivity of both Colombian or Latin American in the case of Valenzuela's participants and queer. This has been kind of an exercise to think about some of these questions, to kind of have almost a proof of concept, if you like, that this is a valuable approach to bring a language lens. But I must say that it's very difficult. It's very difficult for us to look at this data, well, for me to look at this data that I've not collected myself. In fact, when working here with what are translations of original interviews, and so it's here that I bring a reflection on the importance of ethnography, the importance of ethnography not just as a method, but also as an approach to knowledge, about the knowledge that we gain through an ethnographic experience that would give us a lot more depth of analysis than I have been able to share today, unfortunately. An ethnographic perspective really helps us know what we need to know about these people's lives, what we need to know about their practices. But I found this exercise of visiting someone else's data with a language lens as useful as a first step in beginning to answer those questions about where the ethnographic focus needs to be. So what I want to come to is not a conclusion, really. It's not a wrapping up because, as you can see, this is just beginning. It's just a start. But I do want to share an anecdote with you that 2 days ago I was at my desk in my office. I just finished a meeting with a student. So I went on my phone on Instagram and I saw a post by an account that I follow to say that they were raising the Colombian They were raising the LGBTQI plus flag in the Consulado Colombiano for the first time. And I thought, I have to go. I want to see this event. It's something related to the topic that I'm interested in. And so I packed my bag, I went along, I was late. The event was almost over. But being there, I not only saw the event and understood some of the dynamics of this practice and why it was symbolic and why it was important, but also I got to meet the people who had organized the event, who were involved in the event, and we began talking and we ended up having conversations afterwards. That's anecdotal, but it really shows us the value of our ethnographic researcher bodies in our fieldwork in these places. So one thing is doing the sort of secondary analysis on the text that's taken away from the lived experience. But another thing completely is the lived experience of the ethnographic fieldwork. Well, and it's a picture here which is overlapped, but so this was the picture of the flag being raised. And I also wanted to share this final picture, which was from an email that I received today, about an hour and 10 minutes ago, to say that finally my project has been approved. So when I say this isn't a conclusion, it's just the beginning, I'm hoping that, I soon be able to come back and talk to you in the future with some more ethnographic insights and data to share on this topic about the making of these spaces of Sexile in London. So thank you very much. And hopefully we have a nice amount of time for questions, comments, and a bit of a discussion on that.
Pues muchas gracias, Peter. Ha sido pues realmente una reflexión muy interesante, precisamente porque ahora sí que los gatekeepers siempre nos hacen, nos ponen en aprietos, ¿no? Como investigadores y de repente esta idea de, digamos, del rigor tiene sus, tiene sus interpretaciones, ¿no? Es
Mm,
decir, como dices tú, ¿no? ¿Quién decide qué, ¿no? Entonces es muy, muy complejo este mundo. Hay que mirar también desde esta perspectiva de la sociolingüística etnográfica crítica, incluso nuestras propias prácticas académicas, ¿no? Hay que ver con
pues,
sigilo, ¿no? Porque realmente, em, pues ahí está lo que se puede hacer y lo que no se puede hacer, lo que es legítimo y lo que no es legítimo, ¿no? Es una reflexión muy, muy, muy interesante, muy adecuada en nuestros tiempos, que aparentemente hay mucha apertura, pero al mismo tiempo mucha cerrazón, ¿no? Es
mm.
esta tensión igual que vivimos todos por igual, ¿no? Entonces sí, muchas, muchas gracias. Tenemos aquí, déjame ver si tenemos algunas preguntas. Mm, si no, yo tengo aquí algunas que podemos ir haciendo mientras los demás pueden pensar en algunas preguntas. ¿Cómo han actuado las políticas locales para atender las necesidades lingüísticas y económicas de las personas que pertenecen al grupo de LGBTQI más?
Bueno, es una muy buena pregunta. Y es algo que, pues como yo traté de poner en evidencia en la presentación, no se ha investigado, porque en las investigaciones que se han hecho, la cuestión de lengua realmente no ha aparecido. Lo que también me parece pues, interesante notar con relación a esa pregunta es que en el consulado, donde hay, por ejemplo, ese tipo de apoyo normalmente para la comunidad colombiana, no han habido espacios para la comunidad LGBTIQ+. Ayer fue la primera vez que hubo un evento en nombre de esa comunidad en el consulado. Así que no tengo, digamos, evidencia ni datos, pero diría que me imagino que no ha habido una política adecuada debido a varias cosas y es algo que quiero explorar más en cómo se relaciona, por ejemplo, la clase social, la gente que ya viene con cierto nivel de inglés, esos language resources, que no ven la necesidad, entonces pues que no tienen la necesidad, pero hay otros que si vienen exiliados, exiliados que no, de pronto no tienen el nivel de inglés. Entonces, ¿qué pasa ahí? ¿Sí? Y entonces la cuestión política y de políticas es muy importante en cuestión de pues, políticas desde las instituciones, pero también políticas de las prácticas, ¿cierto? Políticas locales, las prácticas de la comunidad y las comunidades.
Muchas gracias, Peter. Aquí tenemos algunos comentarios y preguntas. Mm, a ver aquí. Dice Martina Hall, dice, thanks for a very thoughtful presentation. I wanted to ask if immigrants who are part of the LGBTQI plus community also speak about other spaces outside of the Latin or gay communities, and what role language plays in these spaces. And, wait a second. Mm,
Spaces and interactions, I think it
and
says.
interactions,
Yeah, yeah,
thank you very
yeah.
much.
Like at work, studies. Yeah, so this is a really interesting question, Martina. Thank you. ¿Lo contesto en inglés o español?
Como gustes, totalmente libre.
Okay. As it was in English, I'll reply in English. See, I think it's a really interesting question, and so I think what I'm hoping to explore in terms of space is is exactly that in a sense, but it's also understanding space as, socially constructed space and understanding Sexile as a spatialized experience. So what is it, as a sexiled person, how do you understand and navigate this space of London? So within that, it will be interesting to see, yeah, where are these how does work fit in with that? How do studies fit in with that? I think in what I've seen from the interviews, the interview excerpts that I have access to, um, what becomes very topicalized are these two pillars, right? It's kind of the ethnic spaces and the sexual spaces. But then this is where we need the ethnography, right? Because we don't know the conditions under which those interviews were produced. We don't know the questions that were asked. And we don't know the practices as well. So I think that's really important that it's not only about how do people speak about these places, but how do they construct them through embodied practices. So part of the methodology that I'm happy to say I now have approved is ethnographic shadowing. So exactly, Martina, I'll be following, these participants to work, to school, to their social spaces to see, how do they interact and enact those spaces. So yeah, thank you for the question and watch this space, I guess, for a better answer.
Question. Ahí tenemos otra pregunta de Adriana Patiño. Gracias, Peter, me ha encantado ver cómo has ido construyendo una narrativa transnacional para entender este grupo social. Me gustaría que nos contaras cómo reaccionan los miembros de este grupo social en Londres a lo que pasa en Colombia. ¿Ves algún tipo de construcción de activismo?
Bueno, gracias, Adriana. El activismo que he visto por este momento no ha nacido de la comunidad LGBTI. Puede que no he encontrado las personas correctas, pero el activismo que he visto viene más bien de las comunidades de mujeres exiliadas que sí han salido, han publicado peticiones mm, con respecto a toda la violencia que está pasando en este momento. Em, de hecho, he visto cierta desconexión entre, entre la comunidad acá y la comunidad allá, ¿sí? Que es algo también pensando en espacialidades, experiencias de migrar, esa dislocación o desasociación, sería interesante entender más, porque pues es como la parte más político-activista del proyecto, sería indagar sobre esa parte también.
Aquí Martina tiene otra pregunta.
Ujú.
Ahí sí, tú le estás viendo, si quieres, puedes contestarla. ¿No? Thanks. The results of your
Es-
ethnographic work will be so interesting. May I also ask what was it that made the research so ethically risky? I didn't quite get that. Sorry for my ignorance.
so it's not ignorance. And Lily asked the same question because it's hidden institutionally. Why? I don't know. Um, you know, there's different processes with different faculties, and different types of research are considered high risk. And because I think because it's research that is with a vulnerable group. So some of the participants might be asylum seekers, refugees. They're considered a high risk group. So for that reason, it's been seen as ethically risky, I think. And I choose to believe it's for that reason. And I hope it's for that reason.
Lilia Borges también tiene una pregunta que
Mm.
va muy ligada a esto que nos decía Martina, que había complicado tanto la aprobación del proyecto. Y bueno, una última pregunta. Dado que tu trabajo involucra los estudios de migración, términos como el exilio, así como perspectivas etnográficas, ¿podrías comentar sobre la importancia y los aportes que genera un diálogo interdisciplinar en un trabajo de investigación sociolingüístico como el tuyo?
Sí, bueno, para mí la interdisciplinaridad es clave. Yo, como ustedes habrán visto, yo cito, son fuentes más bien de la geografía, de los estudios queer, em, porque yo veo que desde ahí hay mucho que nos inspira en la sociolingüística, porque la sociolingüística tiene ahí lo socio, y lo socio es muy amplio, lo socio hay que explorarlo y teorizarlo bien, para mí. Yo creo que desde el punto de vista lingüística, nosotros, al menos en mi caso, tuve una formación, o tenemos una formación muy fuerte en la parte lingüística y estamos muy mm, actuales de acuerdo a la teoría lingüística. Pero la teoría social, entendiendo la sociedad en varias sus múltiples aristas, hay mucha teoría que podríamos utilizar para apoyarnos, eh, para entender situaciones que están pasando. Y yo vi, por ejemplo, con ese caso de los exilios, que las teorías, digamos, canónicas de la sociolingüística crítica no me estaban dando lo que necesitaba para entender este caso. Pero una vez que entré en la literatura geográfica, por ejemplo, que habla de espacios, de la literatura de migración, que entiende dislocación, subjetividades. Yo, yo encontré ahí lo que necesitaba para entender ese proceso social. Entonces yo soy de la perspectiva que hay que buscar teoría que nos ayude a entender la sociedad, las prácticas o los fenómenos sociolingüísticos, que no siempre tienen que ser los mismos y no tiene que recaer siempre en la parte lingüística. Podemos también fortalecernos mucho y trae mucho la parte social.
Pues hasta aquí hemos llegado al fin de esta sesión. Te agradecemos muchísimo, Peter, tu presentación, tus reflexiones, las preguntas de todos y estamos muy contentos de haber llegado a este último webinario de este año. Y esperamos que puedan acompañarnos también en agosto, que vamos a tener una escuela de verano. Va a venir la doctora Carolina Gandulfo de la Universidad de Corrientes, Argentina, ¿no? Y pues estaremos también, al igual que con la conferencia de Peter, ¿no? Que nos ha dejado reflexiones profundas y también cercanas, ¿no? Son reflexiones que nosotros también hacemos acá y también nos hemos encontrado con estos retos, ¿no? Así que,
Claro.
pues realmente compartimos completamente tu sentir pues te agradecemos mucho. Eh, pues muchas gracias a todos y pues nos vemos pronto. Hasta luego.
Muchas gracias.